Good evening and welcome to Colorado State University. This is the inaugural Merlin James Paulson Landscape Architecture and Environmental Planning Lecture. The lecture series that will happen every year around the fall is made possible by the generous gift from Professor Paulson. The annual lecture series hopes to bring together students, both college and high school, both practicing professionals and the public for a celebration of landscape architecture and environmental planning. Landscape architecture at CSU shares a history between two colleges, the Warner College of Natural Resources and the College of Ag Sciences. Merlin established the landscape architecture curriculum in 1975 and was the only full-time faculty member teaching in the program. The program started in the College of Natural Resources and by 1978 was approved as a concentration. 3 years later, the major in landscape architecture was approved in the Department of Recreation Resources and Landscape Architecture. There were 3 full-time faculty. Initial accreditation for the program was granted in 1982. 1992, landscape architecture moved to the College of Agricultural Sciences and the Department of Horticulture and Landscape Architecture. Merlin's dedication grew the program to 5 full-time faculty and an average of about 135 students in the major every year. In 2018, after 43 years of burning the midnight oil, Merlin retired. During his teaching career, he raised a family, spent sabbatical leave at Harvard Graduate School of Design, received countless honors and awards, including one of the most influential landscape architects at Harvard. He worked on national and international design competitions, including the Shanksburg, Pennsylvania 9/11 Memorial. Taught nearly every course in the curriculum and had an open door policy just to talk. Today, Merlin continues to reside in Fort Collins and as CSU Professor Emeritus, continually teaches and enjoys his role as a mentor and friend to hundreds of CSU alumni. Merlin is joining us tonight and is participating at a distance. Exactly how to see that. it's somewhere. My name is Brad Getz. I'm a proud 1988 graduate of Merlin's program and a current faculty member. My job tonight is to introduce our guest. Jessica Canfield graduated from CSU Landscape Architecture in 2004 with the American Society of Landscape Architects Honor Award. She spent some time in international private practice before continuing her education at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, graduating with a Master of Landscape Architecture in 2009. She is currently an Associate Professor of Landscape Architecture at Kansas State University. Jessica has been awarded the 2012 Jarvis Emerging Faculty of Distinction in Landscape Architecture Award, the 2013 McElway Family Teaching Award, and the 2014 CELA, Council of Educators Landscape Architecture Excellence in Design Studio Teaching Award. Please join me in welcoming Jessica. Thank you.
Okay. Feedback. Okay, try this again. Okay, one more time. Are the speakers muted on the laptop?
Should be. Yeah, it's muted.
Well, that's muted, but is the sound in the computer muted? I don't think it is.
Oh, I see that.
Good evening. Okay. Okay. Well, thank you so much for being here in person and online. This format, I'm going to go like this all night. But I'm so very humbled and truly honored to be here, giving you this invited inaugural lecture. And putting together this presentation has been a wonderful opportunity to reflect on all the behind the scenes of my career. So often we just see the end photos of final work, but this evening I want to give you a glimpse at some of the backstory. And for the students in the room, My career journey can serve as inspiration for you to dream big and just do it. Work hard and seek joy. I'm deeply passionate about the profession of landscape architecture, and I can't imagine a more perfect discipline for myself. I would not be standing here if it weren't for Merlin's mentorship. He believed in me, pushed me, and even gave me the paintbrush that literally painted this painting. It was what I used the most when I was here as a student. And most importantly, he provided words of wisdom, especially when I was at crossroads. And because of him, I felt empowered to dream big and then chase those dreams. One of my most treasured Merlin sayings was, "Sounds great, can't wait to see it." He would commonly say this during studio desk crits. Though sometimes frustrating to me, it helped me persevere. He'd also tell me, whatever you do, make it beautiful and poetic. In many ways, those simple phrases have been guiding lights throughout my career, which began here at CSU some 2 decades ago. Every fall at Kansas State University, I give a lecture to the first-year design students where I make a passionate pitch for why they should go into landscape architecture. As a requirement of that recruiting lecture, I'm asked to share my story of how I found landscape architecture. And here, this is where I always start my story, Versailles. When I was 17, I took a trip with my high school French class to Europe. We visited 4 countries, and the entire trip was life-changing. But it was especially so during our visit to Versailles. I was so excited to see the famous chateau. It was legendary. However, once we arrived, I was mesmerized by the landscape. How could it be so grand and intentional and meticulously planned? Why hadn't I ever seen this part of Versailles in a book chapter before? As I watched the sunset on the axis of the Grand Canal, I thought to myself, I want to do this. At the time, I had no clue what landscape architecture was, or that it was even a profession at all. But when I started landscape architecture here at CSU in the fall of 1999, I was wide-eyed and ready to learn. So as I said, Versailles is where I typically start my story, but as I was putting this together, I realized that there were actually many precursors to me finding landscape architecture. I'm a Colorado native and a 5th-generation Denverite. I grew up in Southwest Littleton and spent equal amounts of time going on hikes in the foothills and walks along the South Platte River as I did exploring the streets of downtown Denver and attending punk rock shows. This duality of landscape, the urban and the rural, was rooted in my childhood. To understand the behind the scenes and the backstory to my career, I had to sit down and diagram it out. This turned out to be a fascinating exercise, which revealed that despite my typically feeling like a random amalgamation all the time, I was actually someone who clearly planted seeds and plowed paths. And that in hindsight, it really did all connect. In my continued presentation, I will share with you some of my fondest career memories, which for someone who rarely talks about themselves is going to be a tremendous feat. My first few years studying landscape architecture here at CSU were fun and very challenging. I was fully immersed in my studies and I worked as hard as I could. During my 4th year in spring 2003, an opportunity came up to travel to Boston to see a symposium at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. All the CSU faculty planned to attend, and so did several professionals from firms in Denver. The upper year students were strongly encouraged to also attend because the event would be legendary. I had never been to the East Coast, which motivated me enough to find a way to go. Myself and my classmates, Ashley and Jared and Cannon Ivers, went along too. In Cambridge, we met up with Brad and Merlin, who graciously gave us a tour of Harvard Square and Harvard Yard. I distinctly remember Brad showing us how to buy a slice of pizza, fold it in half, and eat while walking. And Merlin shepherded us inside a notable Harvard building to show us a classroom where he once sat. The symposium took place at the GSD in Gund Hall. The mere sight of the legendary structure was thrilling. Inside, we got to walk across the trays, which are the terraced floors that incrementally go smaller the higher up in the building they are. Seeing the chaos of creativity was eye-opening, inspiring, and incredibly intimidating. But man, were we hooked. The seed to someday attend the Graduate School of Design was planted. And Ashley and I wondered, which tray will we someday sit on? Before the conference began, we had a free afternoon. So Ashley, Jared, and I decided to do something completely crazy and pilgrimage to Martha Schwartz's office. She had lectured at CSU the year prior, and we had thoroughly studied her work in school. To us, Martha was basically a celebrity. So with a folded paper map in hand, keep in mind this was pre-smartphones and Facebook hadn't yet been founded, we somehow navigated the spaghetti streets of Cambridge to get to Martha's office. 147 Sherman Street turned out to be a warehouse wedged between a graveyard and a commuter rail line in a totally nondescript part of Cambridge. And we literally just showed up. Giddy but trembling, we knocked on the door. The door opened and everything after that is somewhat of a blur. I have no recollection of what we said or how we convinced the poor guy to let us in, but we went in. And it was magical. It was all there, prototypes of furnishings, the original drawings of the bagel garden, a full library of books, the gold frogs, a model shop with floor to ceiling and supplies. It turned out Martha was out of town, and other than the guy who opened the door, there was only one other person in the room that day. We were truly starstruck, and it looked so fun. But back to the reason we were in Boston. It was for Large Parks. The Large Parks Symposium was a 2-day lecture series that coincided with an exhibit and later a book. The event was organized by George Hargraves and Julia Cerniak, and everybody who was somebody at that time in landscape architecture spoke. It was surreal, hearing the presentations from people whom we'd only read about in our textbooks. We sat in the back, huddled together with our sketchbooks in our laps, and enjoyed the show. The entire experience was amazing and one that truly set the stage for future paths. Fast forward another year to spring 2004. I started putting together my portfolio and getting nervous about what would come next. My cozy college life was about to end, but I knew I needed to do something bold. In a handwritten note from my grandma and a $10 bill for a coffee treat, she wrote, "Dear Jessica, I know you're busy getting your portfolio worked up. Good luck, and I hope whoever looks at it will see your potential. If not, we do." Just on the cusp of graduation, one of my last duties as a SCASLA officer was to orchestrate the annual LA Days lecture series. This meant that one of my duties was to help drive lecturers to and from the airport, which provided me ample time for personal conversation. In 2004, I was tasked to pick up Peter Walker from DIA. During that long ride, he asked what my future plans were. I wanted to take a few months off and travel to Australia, I said. He mentioned that one of his dearest friends, Steve Calhoun, had a firm in Melbourne called Tract, so I should email him. I said that sounded good, but I wasn't sure about the visa situation. So I contacted Steve, sent my portfolio, and asked for a job. He said, yes, would love to have me, as long as you can get a visa. Well, I was able to find a visa that was for short term, 6 months. I could travel for 2, work for 4. So that settled it. My post-graduation plan was Australia. In May 2004, my CSU path came to an end, but the work I completed and the connections I made would carry me forward into new paths. In June 2004, I booked my flight and I headed to Australia. Australia. When I arrived, it was the middle of winter. It was an extra shock to the system, having just spent a week in Los Angeles with a friend. Happily, my aunt and uncle accompanied me on my journey down under. In the late 70s, they had lived in Melbourne for a few years, working as primary school teachers, so they were excited to return for a visit and we could travel together. We traveled all over Victoria, along the Great Ocean Road and up to the vineyards. We visited Canberra and Sydney, which had the most luxurious brown sugar beaches. After several weeks of adventures, they bid me farewell and off to work I went to my first real job. Since it would be short-lived in just 4 months, I was determined to make every minute of my time there in Australia. On the weekends, I went on urban hikes, choosing a different neighborhood each time. I set off on a Saturday morning, bundled up in my coat, hat and gloves, and walked all day. Again, smartphones didn't exist, but I had another paper map and Lonely Planet guidebook. This was pre-Yelp. I always got a coffee, brought my sketchbook, and stopped for an afternoon sweet. I really ate my way through that city. Some Saturdays I logged over 15 miles on foot, which was incredibly easy to do. The job was good. I got experience working on greenways and golf courses. I learned how to work on large project teams and how to work in metric, which was not easy at first. But the best days were spent alone on my urban hikes. The 4 months went fast, and before I knew it, I was done. I arrived home in December, not ideal considering I had just spent my summer living through an Australian winter, and now I was back for the start of a Colorado winter. And I was back to living with my parents, wondering what my next path would be. Hunkered down in their basement, I spent several days applying to all sorts of places in Denver and along the West Coast. I wasn't getting any responses. Then one day, Ashley called me. Jess, I just saw an ad that Martha's hiring. Working at Martha's would be the ultimate dream, but did I dare apply? No, how could I? I was totally underqualified, I thought. However, the prospect of a long-term stay in my parents' basement was enough to get me to apply. So I applied on Monday. Then the design director, Shauna Gilly-Smith, called me on Wednesday for an interview. She asked if I could start on Monday. Monday? What? Are they kidding me? I live in Denver. How could I possibly move to Boston over the weekend? After expressing my logistical hesitations, she said they really needed someone to start right away. I'd be hired short-term hourly, and I'd be able to stay in Martha's house. What? Stay in Martha's house? Well, luckily, I knew right where it was at 147 Sherman Street. Trembling, I agreed. She said, just come and work for 2 weeks. We'll figure out the rest later. I packed a suitcase, booked a flight, and off I went to Boston. I landed Sunday night just after a massive blizzard. It was dark. While the flight landed, I could see piles and piles of snow everywhere. I told the taxi driver at the airport that I was going to 147 Sherman Street. He said, okay, and off we went into the dark, snowy night. He had no idea where we were going. We circled around and around and around in Cambridge, and finally, we made it. I rang the bell and I said, hi, I'm Jessica, I'm here. The voice through the intercom said, okay. The door buzzed and up the stairs I went, trembling about the thought of Martha opening the door, but it wasn't Martha. It was her nanny, and the nanny hadn't a clue who I was or why I was there. I said, hi, I'm staying here for a few weeks and working for Martha. She said, okay, well, she's out of town. I guess I'll show you to your bedroom, and you're welcome to have anything in the fridge. Okay, so now what? I'm in Martha's house, but she's not here. No one knew I was coming, but also they are unfazed by my presence. Strange. The house was like nothing I'd ever seen. From my previous visit, I knew it occupied the back 2/3 of the office, which was probably many thousands of square feet. The bedrooms lined the perimeter of the space, seemed like there were maybe 8 of them. The living room, dining room, kitchen, and ping pong table were all arranged within the remaining wide open space, but separated by curtains of silver ribbon. She had designer furniture, including a set of Frank Gehry corrugated cardboard chairs and real art on the walls, like Ellsworth Kelly real art. There were sculptures and other amazing artifacts, which someone of my stature could not identify. That night, I could hardly sleep. 1, the room was freezing and the bed was on the floor. 2, Martha had a pet bird who was clearly nocturnal. And 3, the building was right next to the commuter line, and every train that passed was deafening and shook the house. The next morning, I got ready for work, stepped out of my bedroom, and made the 30-second commute to the office, where I was cheerfully greeted by Tom Ryan. Utterly confused, I said, hi, I'm Jessica, I'm the new employee. He said, welcome. Martha's staff sits on this side of the room, and my staff sits on the other. Huh, I said. He went on to explain that Ryan Associates rents office space because Martha Schwartz Partners recently downsized. Okay, I see. But what I didn't see were any people sitting in Martha's side of the office. What was I to do? I plopped myself down at the open desk by the window and waited, staring across the cemetery. Eventually, Isabel Zempel, who worked there at the time, showed up. Are you the new intern? Maybe, thinking to myself, I don't know, am I? Or maybe she was expecting someone else. I said, I'm here to work with Shauna. Oh, okay, she'll be in later today. Now I'm starting to feel really weird. It seems no one really knew I was coming, but now I am here and like a totally random stranger staying at Martha's house. My memory isn't totally clear on the remainder of that day, but I was given some busy work and told to whip up a Photoshop rendering based on a sketch that Martha had done for an interior space. Got it. So off I went, hoping to do good enough to justify my keep. At some point, Shauna showed up, welcomed me, and put me to work. And from that point on, I worked and worked. I worked long days and through the weekend. When my 2 weeks were up, I said, well, should I book a ticket home or is there more work to be done? Shauna said, stay, we have lots of work and we can keep you on as hourly staff. And at that time, there were only 3 full-time employees. But what about finding an apartment, I said. It's okay, since we can't offer a permanent position, you can continue to stay with Martha. During my initial 2 weeks, Martha did come home and she was lovely, full of grace and a total diva. The woman knew exactly what she wanted and how to get it. Living with her was a little strange, but also okay. Martha and her husband, Marcus, were rarely home. She was starting her London office at the time. Also living in the house was her youngest son, her little daughter, the nanny, and the housekeeper, Zora, who held down the fort. The 2 weeks turned into 4, then 6, then 8, then 12, and I said, okay, I need to go back to Colorado and get some new clothes. It was starting to be spring, and I was also starting to be homesick. I had been working at Martha's for over 3 months, and I needed to know if the job would be permanent or if I should just go home and not return. Again, Shauna said, there is more work to be done, and we'll be starting the Grand Canal Square. When I returned, this time with 2 suitcases, I rented an apartment, hoping for a better work-life balance. But Grand Canal Square had other plans for me. The high-profile Urban Plaza project was located in Dublin, Ireland. It would be part of the new development on the Docklands. The plaza would sit between a hotel, an office, and a Daniel Libeskind designed theater building, and the plaza would be built first. I used to joke that my job title was actually translator of scribbles. Martha or Shauna would constantly hand me sketches that needed to be refined and digitized. It was frustrating at first. How was I supposed to know what they were thinking and how to fill in the gaps? But eventually I realized how powerful this task was. I was in charge of filling in all the design details and actually figuring out the plans. My translator of scribble task also extended into model making. Not only did I figure out what the design intent was, I had to find physical materials that would be an effective representation. At first, the models were small and simple, but they grew in size and complexity. Eventually, a single strong concept emerged and a more refined client model was made. At this time, I was the only one in the office who could do AutoCAD. So that meant all the drawings and all the renderings were my job. One of the hardest things about that crisscross scheme was that all the spaces between the lines had to be large enough to be built and an overall pleasing proportion. Day after day, like playing a game of pickup sticks, I would rotate one line ever so slightly to fix one problematic area, which then caused another problematic area elsewhere. The task seemed simple enough, but it was an epic logistical challenge. Eventually, we arrived at a final plan, the red carpet, perfectly lined up with the theater doors, the marsh planters perfectly aligned with the cafe, and the overall circulation worked. And the fountains were located in structurally supportive areas. At last, the design was complete, seen here in a professionally rendered view, not by me. But the design was nowhere near done, and all the detailing began. Happily, there were now several more employees in the office to help do the work. But I also continued to work on the fountain, the red poles, and the benches. And the project became big news. But though the project was a hit, all the work took a toll on me. It was a vicious cycle that I worked too much not to have a life, but I couldn't have a life because I worked too much. Eventually, the novelty of it all wore off. I missed my friends and my family, and it was time for a new path. The work at Martha's had been great, and I was torn about giving it up. But I knew that I needed to expand my skills, vary my project experiences, and learn from new people. I left Martha's just short of a year. Before leaving, I sent out resumes to firms in Denver, but crickets. Nobody was hiring. I was set on being in Denver, so I decided to just go home and wait it out. And in the interim, travel. This time, my sights were set on Japan. I couldn't afford the ticket, so I applied for one of those miles credit cards, and somehow it equated to enough for a free airfare. Right before my trip, I got a call from Ida. Hey, we just landed a few big projects. How soon can you start? Well, as soon as I'm back. See you in 3 weeks. I started working at Ida in Denver at the end of 2005. What a difference. Instead of 2 colleagues, I had more than 60. I was hired into a team that was working on master planned community in Colorado Springs. Quite the change of pace. On the day I was assigned to figure out the mailbox locations, I thought to myself, oh dear, I've made a mistake. But everything is a lesson, and this was a lesson in learning how I didn't want to spend my time. But I worked hard, and eventually new project opportunities opened up, including some mountain resorts and mixed-use developments and the Four Seasons Resort in Bahrain. I worked on so many projects that my colleagues jokingly called me the perpetual intern because everybody wanted me on their projects. The most significant project, though, was Westerly Creek Phase 2, which is the stream daylighting and ecological restoration project at Stapleton. The work was so different than my other experiences. I felt underprepared, but the project manager, Jane, was so kind and mentored me and called out my mistakes. Those plants can't go there. You did what with the grading? But she always explained what I'd done wrong and how to fix it. The project was completely different than my work at Martha's in every way possible, yet it was equally enthralling. 2006 and 2007 at Ida were great years. The project work was plentiful, my colleagues were excellent, and I lived downtown. We worked hard and played hard too. This was the life. But if I wanted to teach, I needed to leave. I applied to the GSD in spring 2007. I was accepted and I departed my fair Denver in September on an eastbound path again. This time I moved to Boston with more than just a suitcase. My dad rented a minivan and we filled it up and set off for our downhill adventure from mile high to sea level in 3 days with sightseeing along the way. He got me set up in my apartment by the river, flew back to Denver. Wow, I was here. I couldn't believe it. During my first semester at the GSD, I lotteried into Gary Hildebrand's studio set in South Boston called 500,000 Trees. To be honest, though the topic was fascinating, I was jealous of my classmates who had project sites in India and Spain. Southie seemed somewhat of a letdown. Yet what Southie offered and what the other students missed out on was the opportunity for multiple site visits and the ability to spend meaningful time within a neighborhood. I spent many Saturdays doing urban hikes through Southie, which allowed me to think about all sorts of things well beyond the studio project. The transition into the GSD studio culture was hard. I felt like an outsider as an MLA too. Most of my classmates were in the MLA1 program, and they had been at the GSD for a year. They knew each other and how to produce GSD style renderings and models. I knew AutoCAD and how to make construction documents. But Gary was a fabulous professor, and I learned a lot while sitting on tray 3. The next semester was completely different. I lotteried into an urban design studio. The project site was in Ireland, and we got to travel there. And very fortunately, we also got to spend a day in Dublin. Grand Canal Square was built, and I finally got to see it. It was surreal to actually be standing in a space that I had only known from drawings and models. There was sun, wind, birds, and people. It was now real. By mid-semester, everyone was making summer plans. I thought about going back to EDA in Denver, but a friend suggested I apply to Gustafson Guthrie Nickel in Seattle. He knew of my desire to go to the West Coast and how much I admired GGN's work. What did I have to lose? Nothing. I made a new portfolio and applied for their summer internship. I got an interview. I'll never forget the call from Jennifer Guthrie. She said, well, this interview is a bit of a formality. We need to do it, but let's make it short. We were really impressed by your submission and we want to hire you as a summer intern. What? I was in total shock. I told my good news to a classmate, to which they said, wow, what good luck you have. Luck? Really? Luck? I work damn hard all the time. Maybe this was good timing, but it seems more than luck. So another new path was forged. Off I went to Seattle for the summer. Like Martha, Catherine was hardly ever there. The firm was full and the only open seat at the time was at Catherine's desk. So there I was, the intern, sitting at the best seat in the office, spending my days gazing across the sound, watching the clouds play peekaboo with the Olympics, and memorizing the ferry schedule based on observation, all while doing Photoshop and CAD. The projects were great, the people were great, and Shannon she tasked me with developing the planting design based on her loose sketch for the perimeter of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation building. I was completely unfamiliar with the plants in the Northwest, but I did lots of research. And again, I made mistakes that were corrected. She asked that I learn land effects and teach my colleagues. Little did I know these new skills would be especially useful later on when applying to K-State. Before returning to the GSD for the fall semester, I traveled to India with a classmate for an independent study on rainwater harvesting. We had written a grant and received funding to go. The experience could be an entire sub-story, but I'll have to be brief and just say it turned out to be the seed for my thesis and content for my first academic publication. Now on tray 5 and my final year at the GSD, I decided to write a thesis instead of more studio work. I was so underprepared to do the work. I hadn't had a proper research methods course, I wasn't the strongest writer, and I didn't have any parallel classmates. It was just me and a few unmarked students doing a thesis that year. The experience was one of my most challenging. I was alone in my endeavor, but I had an idea and I was committed to working it out. I was interested in understanding and evaluating the relationship between how landscapes looked and how they performed. John Beardsley agreed to be my chair, and my committee members were Richard Foreman and Peter Del Tredici. I chose case studies as my main method, and I used Westerly Creek, the traditional rainwater harvesting in Chennai, and the Boston Fens. I developed a qualitative framework to examine their visual and functional qualities. This work, in hindsight, was foundational, predating the sites rating system and the Landscape Architecture Foundation's Landscape Performance Series. While working on my thesis, Richard Foreman invited me to TA his urban ecology undergraduate course. I had been a TA for course studios at the GSD too, but this opportunity was different. I helped him prepare course materials and got to lead a lecture on graphic representation for site analysis, something totally in my wheelhouse. But I was so intimidated by the students in the course who were Harvard undergraduates and presumably brilliant. I stood up there and I couldn't even peel my eyes from the presentation screen. Afterwards, Professor Foreman said, "Nice job, but next time, try looking at the audience." Eek, I messed up, but he was gracious, and the next time I did better. Spring 2009 eventually arrived, and after the longest 8 months ever, I finished and defended my thesis, the high performance landscape. I was ready for the next path, but the economy had crashed in September 2008, and most design work had dried up. By spring 2009, many of my colleagues in practice had lost their jobs, and no one was hiring. For a student-to-be graduate, the outlook was bleak. However, a former colleague from Denver called me, "Jess, K-State's hiring. You should apply." Blake and I had left EDA at the same time. He went to K-State to start a tenure track position, and I to the GSD. Though the central reason for me going to graduate school was to get an MLA to someday teach, this opportunity felt too soon. Was I ready? I always imagined pursuing teaching later in my career, not right out of school at the ripe old age of 28. Again, with nothing much to lose, I formally applied. The search committee called for a phone interview, which led to a competitive multi-candidate on-campus interview. However, at some point during the hiring process, the tenure track line was rescinded because of budget cuts. It would now just become a one-year assistant professor position. I was offered the job. Great, I can do anything for a year, even go to Kansas. I was hired specifically to teach plantings design and beginning site design. Between leaving Boston and moving to Kansas, I had one more grand trip planned, an adventure in Greece with one of my best friends. Well, it turns out Kansas is not that bad, which is a cute little saying printed on swag around town. I immediately fell in love with the prairie landscape, its gentle rolling hills and endless sky, and with the charming little college town of Manhattan. That first year of teaching was hard. I pulled more all-nighters than I had in undergrad and grad combined. The amount of preparation and behind-the-scenes work needed to do my job was enormous. This, of course, is still true today, but I had no materials that first year, and I had to build my entire foundation. In spring 2010, the one-year position turned into a formal tenure track line, but because of university hiring protocols, I had to formally apply for the job again. And after another competitive multi-candidate interview, I was offered the tenure track position. I'm so thankful my department head, Stephanie Raleigh, saw my potential and took a risk. Over the next 6 years on tenure track, I continued to build and refine courses and start my research agenda, which focused on landscape performance. In 2011, the Landscape Architecture Foundation began a research initiative seeking to define and measure the performance of landscapes. I felt validated. My seemingly unguided thesis was now relevant. I applied to be a research fellow in the first year of the case study investigation program, and I was accepted. The experience in developing case studies led me to eventually help co-author the published guidebook evaluating landscape performance. The teaching aspects of my job are simply the best. Investing my all into the students and seeing their growth and development are what keeps me going. In addition to the research and teaching, I get to do creative work. In fall 2013, I decided to submit a design for the Chaumont-sur-Loire International Garden Festival. I had been enamored by the festival ever since Brad took us there during our Europe Summer Studio in 2002. The theme for 2004 would be Gardens of the Deadly Sins. Having traveled to the festival another time in 2011 with my now husband, I was inspired to create a garden best suited for play. While there in 2011, I saw numerous school kids on field trip, yet the gardens for the most part, though quirky and occupiable, were not well suited for kids to be in and explore. So my driving idea was play, and my chosen sin was greed. The concept was based on the American obsession for a perfectly green and manicured lawn, a sinful use of resources. Yet synthetic turf offers year-round vegetal perfection and is predictably green without intensive maintenance. The ground plane was a two-tone long quilt made of true-to-life synthetic varieties. For whimsy and fun, 2 play mounds were included to offer seating and ramps for romping. In lieu of a water feature, a large gazing dome was put at the center, providing an ever-changing reflection of light. And to my absolute amazement, the garden was selected as one of 26 to be built that year, and the only from a US designer. The thing about winning, however, was that now I had to build it in the span of 2 weeks. Insert massive stress. I conscripted 2 of my students and 2 local builders to accompany me to France and build the garden. The festival provided us housing in the carriage houses of the Chaumont Chateau. We shipped all of our tools to the site, not knowing what would be available for us to use once we were there. The turf was produced in Belgium and it arrived on site in large rolls. The gazing dome came from China, and it was uncertain if it would ever actually arrive. And after 2 very long but short weeks, we pulled it off. Katie, Natalie, Rod, Tom, and I were exhausted. I couldn't have done it without them. And though I never got to return to see the garden in action during the festival, I heard it was well received. And as I close out my presentation, I wanted to end on my greatest path of all, motherhood. Now 6 and 4, these 2 goofballs are the best part of my life. They fill my days with joy and my weekends with mud and laundry. The career journey would not have been possible without the love and support of my family, my friends, and my colleagues. Thank you all, I'm forever grateful. So in conclusion, go adventure and make it beautiful and poetic. Thank you. So I think we have time for questions if there are any. I guess that just never give up. I mean, certainly I'm not the most confident person, but I never gave up. I worked as hard as I could. And I guess I would say I wasn't deterred. I knew what was exciting to me and I just never gave up. Yep. What's next? Sorry, I knew somebody would say that. I don't know. I've been at K-State 14 years now, and I think I'm just really in love with just living my little life and spending the time with those cute little rugrats. And I don't know, but I did a studio last fall. We looked at the urban forest of Manhattan, Kansas, inspired by my experience with Gary at the GSD. And it revealed to me a genuine and pressing need for a nonprofit to become something in Manhattan. We are losing more tree canopy every year than it's being replaced, and the city's funds are never getting bigger. So I don't know how to work that into an academic career. I already have 2 jobs. I can't afford to have another job. But I'm really passionate now about making local change within a community that I live. So something where I can sort of invest in the place that I've been in now for a long time. Yeah. That one's fairly easy for me. It's ever changing. It's always something new. you know, it's like it's reinventing itself, or new opportunities emerge every year, every 2 years. And so I think that it inherently is just constantly in this moment of shift and flux, and there's new opportunities constantly. There's always new things to learn. I mean, I feel like I've been in it for, over 20 years, but there's so much more to learn. So I think that's just what keeps me going, is that it's endlessly creative, and there's always going to be new opportunities that are around the next corner. Yeah.
Right now, we still have opportunity.
Yeah.
How do you balance that now?
Well, I don't know if it's ever a balance. I always imagine like this diagram that it's a scale. It's never like that. It's always like this. So I think that, there's spurts where there's intense activity and focus on something, and then you can kind of peel back and shift focus on something else. I would say that I think I do better at my work now because I can invest in my family and my friends and have more time with them. And so that nourishes me and then gives me more energy to focus on the work that I do every day. But I think it's possible to have multiple jobs at one time. And you just sort of figure out when and how to invest your time. I think that's kind of part of my strategy. Is it's hard to let some little things go, but I can't fret about all the little things all the time anymore. So I'm always trying to get better at that. It's like focus on where it matters the most. Thank you for the question. Okay. Any more on Zoom? All right. That's hard. That's hard. I think that now, I do love these little creative side projects. And I think one thing that has been challenging in academia is sometimes it is really lonely. That, I'm not in this like hive mind of an office where everybody's like on the team going for a project. I sort of have to craft out my own little projects, and I love collaborative work, but it isn't quite the same as an office. So that's the part that I miss the most. But also I love that I have a lot of independence right now, and that I can pursue things that I feel are valuable, that are important for students to know and learn, and for teaching, and things that, that I want to spend my time on. So I don't know that I would go into the thick of practice again, but if there was a side opportunity, maybe when my kids are older, perhaps. There's still a lot more life to live. Yep. Well, I think that it's important. I think you heard several times in my presentation that I always weave in travel. And I always just made those opportunities happen. It's not like I was sitting on a bucket of money that I could spend. Like I always leveraged opportunities wherever I went, to stay with somebody I knew, to stay with somebody that somebody knew. It's like making these little connections and then capitalizing on them. So whenever I had a moment to travel anywhere, where it was international or domestic, you just take the opportunity, and you'll never regret it. I don't think. Even when things go wrong when you're traveling, you'll never regret it. So I think that traveling and seeing places and getting inspired really nourishes me. And so these past 2 years, I haven't done very much traveling. And so this year, next week, actually, I'm taking some students to Boston, and I get to go attend the ASLA conference in San Francisco in November. So I'm really looking forward to getting on an airplane again and going and seeing sights and doing urban hikes, eating food. So yeah, I think it's getting out and letting my observations and just absorb the world around me. Yeah, that's Moderation. I think 24. Yep. Yep. That's good. Again, any moment you get, gotta go. Yes.
Are you seeing the overlapping? Speaking of collaboration,
Yeah, so the department actually at K-State is the Department of Landscape Architecture and Community and Regional Planning. It's the longest department title on campus. So yes, we are combined, and and the students do take some courses together. And I think that one of the harder things is kind of building a culture where the planners don't necessarily want to sit in the studio like everybody else in the design college does. And so I think that that's kind of taking time, is to try to sort of build this culture for the happenstance that occurs when you're sitting next to people of other disciplines. But within the curriculum, they do connect. And obviously the professions, overlap. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being here and on Zoom. Thank you.